In early 1920, America faced a crucial decision as the nation's railroads stood at a crossroads after years of government control. Railroad executives gathered in Washington to confront the problems created by wartime federal management of America's rail system. The numbers revealed a troubling reality. Deferred maintenance and mounting deficits threatened the backbone of American commerce. Every detail of these historic discussions was recorded, as the future of America's transportation network hung in the balance. These deliberations would reshape American infrastructure, balancing private enterprise with public interest in unprecedented ways. The Railroad Administration had mobilized America's rails for war, sacrificing maintenance and financial stability for victory. Government reports revealed billions in deferred maintenance and operational losses that private companies would soon inherit. Director Walker studied the stark contrast between pre-war private operation and wartime government control. Neither model worked alone. A new solution emerged in draft legislation, the Transportation Act of 1920, promising a balanced regulatory approach. With these crucial documents in hand, Walker prepared to champion a transition requiring compromise from all sides. While officials debated policy, America's railroad workers gathered in union halls, their livelihoods hanging in the balance. James Cooper voiced the fears of millions. Would private ownership mean lower wages, longer hours, and reduced safety? The faces in this Chicago hall represented America's railroad workforce, united in their demand for protection. Their demands were clear: fair wages, reasonable hours, safety guarantees, and a voice in shaping their future. Outside, the constant movement of trains reminded everyone that America's dependence on railroads would never change. In Congress, representatives gathered to craft legislation guiding America's railroads back to private ownership. Representative Esch and Senator Cummins led proceedings that would create the most significant transportation law of the era. Railroad executives warned that without financial relief, private companies couldn't restore America's deteriorating rail system. Labor representatives countered that workers who sacrificed during wartime deserved protection under private control. The gallery overflowed with stakeholders: farmers shipping crops, manufacturers moving goods, and everyday travelers. Away from public hearings, the real work of compromise unfolded as lawmakers sought middle ground between competing interests. Every line on these maps represented communities whose economic survival depended on reliable railroad service. Experts debated intricate details of financial relief and labor protection, seeking balance between competing needs. Line by line, the Esch-Cummins Act took shape, creating the Railroad Labor Board to prevent strikes while ensuring fairness. As evening fell, consensus emerged on legislation that would fundamentally transform American transportation for decades. In luxurious boardrooms, railroad executives confronted the challenges of resuming private operation after government control. Harold Morgan outlined harsh realities. Taking back control meant inheriting worn equipment and uncertain regulations. Financial projections showed years of investment would be needed, while simultaneously meeting new regulatory requirements. Each executive represented different regional interests, all seeking advantage in the coming reorganization of rail service. Despite differences, one vision united them: restoring America's railroads while reclaiming their status in transportation. In thousands of communities, local train stations served as lifelines, connecting small towns to the wider world. Eleanor Hargrove helped her neighbors understand how Washington decisions would affect their daily reliance on rail service. For local merchants and families, policy debates meant practical concerns. Would shipping costs rise? Would service decline? The daily train's arrival represented continuity amid change. America would always depend on these steel lifelines. As station masters posted new rates, communities faced the reality that transition costs would be shared by all Americans. On February 28, 1920, in the White House. One of America's most consequential infrastructure laws awaited approval. The Transportation Act of 1920 promised a new approach, balancing private operation with public oversight. Photographers prepared to capture this pivotal moment when America would embark on a new transportation experiment. The diverse gathering reflected all who shaped the legislation: industry leaders, workers, and public advocates. With a signature, President Wilson enacted a law returning railroads to private ownership while creating new protections. In Chicago, America's rail center, a revolutionary experiment in labor relations, began with the Railroad Labor Board. Chairman Fontaine called to order this unprecedented body representing labor, management, and the public interest equally. Union representatives and company officials watched intently as this new federal entity began exercising its authority. Every decision would set precedent for resolving disputes in America's most essential transportation industry. Outside the windows, Chicago's rail yards continued operating, their commerce affected by every decision in this room. Returning to private ownership meant reorganizing America's entire rail system, thousands of locomotives and millions of cars. Richard Townsend faced logistical challenges, identifying which equipment belonged to which company after years of unified operation. Deferred maintenance revealed itself in worn wheels and aging boilers, the hidden costs of prioritizing wartime service. Behind every piece of equipment lay complex calculations. Who would pay for repairs from where during government control? Gradually, order emerged as cars were sorted, locomotives reassigned, and railroads reclaimed their individual identities. The true test came quickly as the Railroad Labor Board confronted wage reductions proposed by newly privatized companies. James Cooper argued that workers who accepted wartime sacrifices shouldn't bear the financial burden of transition. Railroad executives countered that without cost reductions, essential infrastructure investment would be impossible. Board members representing the public had to balance worker welfare against maintaining national transportation needs. Beyond the windows, workers continued operating the trains that couldn't stop for economic debates or policy discussions. Newspaper offices raced to interpret how regulatory changes would affect millions of Americans dependent on rail service. Headlines reflected transportation's impact on everyday life, affecting food prices, manufacturing, and travel opportunities. Journalists struggled to explain how the same ruling could be seen as both victory and defeat, depending on perspective. Different newspapers framed identical events through contrasting lenses, reflecting the debate about regulation versus enterprise. As editions rolled off presses, Americans formed opinions about the railroad transition based on these complex interpretations. 6 months later, Congress reconvened to evaluate progress. Had the balance between private operation and public interest worked? Railroad executives reported progress: equipment repairs, stabilized schedules, and returning investor confidence. Labor representatives acknowledged improvements while identifying regions where companies resisted board recommendations. Public advocates showed how transportation costs affected everything from bread prices to manufacturing wages nationwide. The transition from crisis legislation to ongoing governance was succeeding, with the Esch-Cummins framework proving adaptable. Farmers benefited from more reliable shipping as private railroads restored equipment and expanded rural service. Manufacturing boomed with improved transportation, raw materials arriving on schedule, and finished products reaching markets. For ordinary Americans, restored passenger service meant renewed mobility, families reuniting, and business travel resuming. Railroad workers found stability in standardized practices, consistent rules, and wage structures replacing uncertainty. Through changing seasons, America's recovery strengthened alongside its transportation system, proving the reform's success. By 1925, grand new terminals rose across America, monuments to renewed confidence in rail transportation. Technology flourished under private ownership, with electric locomotives and modern signaling improving efficiency and safety. The once controversial Esch-Cummins Act had earned its place in history by balancing interests to preserve vital infrastructure. For everyday Americans, the legacy appeared in reliable schedules and reasonable fares. Policy debates had created real improvements. As highways and air travel emerged on the horizon, railroads remained America's foundation, a legacy of the 1920s successful transition.